Hi, everyone, and welcome to this incredible session, not just about cool tech like generative AI, but about responsibility and ethics. We are so excited that you joined us for this session, and we look forward to seeing all of your comments and questions and connecting with you after this session as well. Today, I have some amazing guests with me that we're going to have a fun fireside chat and just connect with each other, share some really interesting and unique perspectives with you. And rather than try to introduce either of these amazing women, I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So I have a question to set us up for the next 45 minutes or so in this conversation. And I would love for each of you to answer this. Maybe we'll start with you, Sorabel. What brought you to the point in your career right now where we're having this conversation? And I wrote some notes for myself to make sure I asked the right questions at the right time. So hopefully you all will understand. But what brought you to this point in your career? And then also, why do you care about this, right? What sparked that passion within you? And I would love to hear, and of course the audience would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here. Discussing this very important topic with you and Renee. What brought me here? I have a background in public policy, right? So I'm very, I'm a public servant. I served the United States for a decade before moving over to tech. I used to work for Meta in trust and safety. And I used to work in a very, very important topic that is protecting our users, protecting our people in what is our public square nowadays. So working in that team that built and iterated on that content moderation tool, and then working on content regulations that are coming from everywhere in the world, especially from the EU, it just hit me that we're about to move into very new territory that, technology is moving at a rapid pace, and I just don't feel that our government is keeping up. And so I think it's imperative for us in responsible tech and responsible AI to ask the hard questions, to keep companies on their toes and to just talk about this. And what brought me here is just realizing how little we all know about what's happening right now in AI. Like, we have very little information about what's happening. And so, yeah, this is what brought me here. And thank you for having me again.
Literacy is one of my biggest, I think we've talked about this before, Sorabel, actually. Literacy is one of my biggest concerns, right? How do we keep the world literate about this evolution of tech and its impact? So thank you so much for that introduction. Renee, I would love for you now to take a moment and introduce yourself and tell us why you're so passionate about this.
Thank you so much. And, it's quite an honor to be here with both of you. So I'm Renee Cummings, and I am a criminologist and a criminal psychologist, but I'm also an AI ethicist, a data activist, and a professor of practice data science at the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia. So I came into the world of AI through criminology and those very troublesome risk assessment tools that we were using and we still use in the criminal justice system. These tools that determine whether or not someone is going to be detained, whether or not someone is going to get bail, whether or not someone is going to be paroled. And these were really life and death decisions that we were making with these algorithmic decision-making systems. So I think for me, it was the question always of justice. Are we using these tools fairly? And the question, of course, of fairness and accountability and transparency. These were the things that really had me thinking about these algorithmic decision-making systems. And what we were seeing in the criminal justice system is that we were using these algorithmic tools, and these tools were continuously overestimating the risks of Black and brown people. So there was something there that just needed further investigation. And of course, as a criminologist and someone who had worked in a homicide investigation and training police officers across the realm of techniques, everything from intelligence-led policing to predictive policing and precision policing, and just looking at the ways in which we dealt with data in the criminal justice system made me realize that if we are going to do technology responsibly, and if we're going to deploy algorithms in the criminal justice system, we had to understand the risks. And the risks were there because we were using historical data. And if you're using historical data, then you are going to repeat history. And if we have a history that is complicated and often contrived and very challenging for particular groups, then we were designing and deploying and adopting and adapting to new technology, but we were replicating and repeating past pains and prejudice and, of course, bigotry and bias and discrimination. So that was the work, criminal justice, that made me realize that something was happening with technology. And we know that when we think about criminal justice, we know that it is really a place where we need to get things right because you're playing with people's lives, their freedom. So it was about data. It was about decision making. It was about how do we use these tools in ways in which we are always accountable and transparent. How do we understand the trauma of the data that we continue to use? And how do we really create a collective mindset where we're using machine and our minds together to really build a better future? So for me, it was always about justice. It was always about equity, inclusivity, and diversity. And that is what brought me to this place of being an AI ethicist and, of course, a data activist. The first data activist at the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia.
I probably should introduce myself. My name is Noelle Russell. I currently lead global AI solutions at Accenture. I'm also part of the Center of Excellence at Accenture, dedicated to generative AI and leading our industry awareness, right? What does this mean per industry? I have a big passion for, let's be specific, right? And similarly, criminology is different than retail, is different than healthcare, but all of them have very real implications when it comes to justice, when it comes to making sure that there's fairness. Yes, so I absolutely, so excited to have you both here. As we move to the next question, I wanted to find out what your perspective was. You know, all of us, we were drawn to responsible, ethical use of this technology long before ChatGPT became a thing, right? So I would love to get your understanding or perspective on how has that maybe changed, right? Maybe Renee, we'll start with you and go to Sorabel. Like, how do you feel, or what do you think the impact of generative AI is now on this concept of ethics and responsible AI that we've been so close to?
I think what it does, it makes us put a closer sort of microscope on the ways in which we're doing responsible technology. Now, one of the things I love to say is that I love AI, right? I love working in data. AI is probably the most transformative technology ever. It has the potential and the promise to really redefine every business model and to bring a real vibe when we talk about creativity, the things that we can do, and the ways in which we can improve humanity, because we have the power with data to really reimagine, to really sort of redefine, to reposition so many things. Generative AI makes it more exciting. It does that, but it also makes us understand and take a closer look at the risks, because it introduces some more risks and it amplifies some other risks. So there's great promise, extraordinary potential. We have this technology like generative AI that could do absolutely amazing things, but there are risks: privacy risks, contract risks, cybersecurity risks, bias and discrimination being amplified. We're looking at the data sets. Where are we getting the data? Who's scraping the internet? You know, we're thinking about all of those things. So it has us thinking more. It definitely has us thinking more. For me, I like to believe that we approach these things with an open mind. Technology is where we are, and technology is continuing and will continue to drive the way we move forward. We're all about designing futures. So it really means for me, you cannot fear. You have got to educate. You have got to make people aware. You've got to put the information out there, and you've got to let people know this is a tool. This is an aid. This is a companion. This is not a human being. So for me, I think when I think of generative AI, it's definitely, and as I say, AI is the language in which we're speaking. Generative AI is a language as well. It comes back to being literate about technology. It comes back to that question of education. How do we educate individuals to use these technologies responsibly? And for the developers and the designers and the persons who are going to adopt these technologies, for them to understand those ethical questions that are critical and those risks. So the risks could be, whether or not it can be anything from financial to reputational to just the risk of communities that may not have access, or communities that may continue to be vilified, and some of them to be replaced, and some of them not to be recognized, and some of them to be not represented. So when I think about generative AI, I say, people need to understand these technologies. They need to understand how to use them ethically, and they need to know how to detect those risks. And they need to know that a lot of the information that you may see may not be accurate, and they really look like, well-constructed falsehoods, and what they call the AI hallucinations. And for me, it's just about teaching and letting people understand that this is the way forward, and you're going to have to understand how to work with it.
Yes, I love that we have a recurring theme already around literacy and education. I think it is going to be something, and we're, of course, all three very passionate about that. And maybe we'll give the audience some tips and tricks on how to get started with that towards the end. But would love, Sorabel, for your perspective on kind of, what do you think is changing, or maybe what's maybe the evolution? I don't know, just very interested in how does responsible AI, fit into this kind of new world of generative AI, in your opinion?
Yeah, so for me, coming from a trust and safety and privacy lens, I'm just very concerned about, the marginalized groups becoming more marginalized. So, for example, women and girls and children, but specifically women and girls. As you know, there's a thing called cyberbullying, and there's also a thing called deepfakes. So can you imagine just if you want to pull a prank or actually hurt someone, a young woman, you can do really bad things and just really, really marginalize someone, hurt someone. The same goes for ethnic minorities, not just in the US, but in other countries. Imagine if you have, let's say, a Christian in a majority Muslim country, and someone can do a deepfake and say this person said a blasphemy against, our religious figure. And so that can really, really hurt the individual as well as, entire groups of people. There's also the privacy part. I'm a privacy nerd, right? And, I've studied EU laws around privacy. And this is like completely out there. When you go into some of those chatbots, right, you don't know what they're doing with that data. You don't know if that data is going to be saved and then be used to sell you stuff or used against you. So for me, this is very high risk. This is very scary. And what concerns me most is that everyone is just playing around with it and seeing how they can profit off of it. And so am I. But I don't think we are stopping to think what are the consequences of putting all of our thoughts in those chatbots, right? Like, what can happen? How can that come back to us? So those are, I mean, there are many other concerns that I have, but I would say that those are the strongest two.
Yeah, I really appreciate your perspective on privacy, right? And I think oftentimes I'm very much responding to the excitement and the enthusiasm around this technology, around what people have played around with on the internet, and then they bring it into their business. And I have to be like, okay, so it's the Chat GPT thing is a web application and it's a research model and it's learning from you, which is great, good, but you should know that that's what's happening. Like it's taking what you're giving it, and not only is it, of course, mining the data that's being generated from your questions, but it's actually mining the questions itself. Maybe that leads us to our next question. I'd love to think about this from the business perspective, right? I wonder, as a bunch, like I said, many companies, especially executives, have come to me, certainly technical executives have come to me and been like, what should I know about this? They already understand the excitement, but they're instantly now being like, I should be worried. It gives me a bit of hope, because it's not a lens that AI really triggered in our, like in the executive audience. They were just like, yeah, if it could save us money, great, let's use it. They didn't really, but this, because of the nature, the viral nature of this, we're seeing businesses kind of take a step back and be like, wait, what should I be worried about, right? What's keeping me up at night? So I would love, we don't want to go too Black Mirror, but what should businesses be thinking about? From your perspective, how do they think about this so that they don't end up putting something into production and hurting people as a result? Like, what are some ideas that come to you? Maybe Sorabel, we'll start with you and then we'll go to Renee.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And if I were in your shoes and I would be advising businesses, I would point them to the EU AI Act. It has not passed yet. It's a proposal still being proposed, but it has different categories of risk. And if you just read it and look at what they're seeing, what they're planning, I think that helps quite a bit. So, for example, they've identified high risk in things like migration, asylum, and border control management. So that means that AI systems maybe don't have a place in those categories because of the built-in bias that AI can have, right? So also justice and democratic processes should not rely on AI. Law enforcement, educational and vocational training, and employment specifically, it's very important to just keep these things in mind. If I have an algorithm making all of my decisions for this very human, very important processes, then is that fair? Is that fair to people? Is that fair to minorities? Is that fair to women? So I would highly encourage businesses to look at the EU AI Act and just take a cue from there. And yeah, I would just study this act, even if you don't implement it fully. Just take a look at it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because of course I am of the mindset, I always say to people, like, AI is never broken, right? It's just untrained. And what I have seen businesses do over time is get very, let's just say, impatient with the outcome, right? So that as it started requiring deeper and deeper levels of inclusion of data, or inclusion of, having a team that would think differently about building it, I just think it's really interesting that they'd be like, you know what, let's just not do it, right? Like, rather than do it right, let's just not do it at all. So I always encourage people, like you said, like, use this as a way to think about AI. I think it does identify the areas that we should be thinking about. But I also think, like, it's up to every business, right? Government's not governing this right now. It is not regulated. So I would love to have Renee, you talk a little bit about what your perspective is. I mean, I love it because you actually teach our up and coming leaders about this.
Well,
So we'd love to
this
understand more about
is
that.
what I will say. Businesses have got to think about several things. You've got to think about the risks, and you've got to think about the fact if you don't pay attention to those risks, you're going to create some major crises for your organization. So you have got to understand AI. You've got to understand generative AI. You've got to understand the challenges of the data that's being used to build these systems. You've got to understand the risks of these large language models, and there are extraordinary risks. Now, everyone's rushing to market. Everyone wants to bring something there that someone can buy and someone can use, and everybody wants, to feel as though they're part of this hype and this excitement. But there are some real challenges in there. There are some challenges that could really shake things up positively and negatively in your business. So when you're thinking about generative AI, you're thinking about intellectual property. You have got to think about that. You're thinking about how using this tool could change the nature of your contracts, the contracts that you may have with different vendors. If your employees are using this tool, then is it really their creative work? Or is it that you have now subcontracted generative AI to do work for you? If you have a government contract, then you can find yourself in a whole lot of trouble if you're using generative AI to do that work. And then there is this question around deceptive practices that the AI hallucination once repeated and replicated and put out there into that information stream. You can find yourself being, being in not in compliance because of questions around deceptive marketing. And then, of course, disinformation, the speed and scale that disinformation travels, that is so critical. So you've got to think about that. Then the privacy concerns that Sorabel mentioned, of course, cybersecurity risks. There are huge risks if this technology, in particular code, if someone or bad actor decides to use this in a way, the speed and the scale in which this will be disseminated into the public domain is critical, because once tech is out there, we can't pull it back. So there are major, major risks and challenges. And of course, the amplification of bias and discrimination and bigotry and prejudice, and how these challenges are going to be for various communities and at various levels. So those are the risks. And if you get any of those risks sort of like streamlining into your business model, then you can have a crisis, and that crisis could impact your organization in real time. So if you plan to use these technologies, you have got to be ahead of the game, because we know the law is always way behind the technology. And one of the challenges with generative AI is the governance question, is the question of regulation. And what we're realizing now is that we need real-time governance, maybe soft and hard approaches that come together for us to deal with these technologies, because they are coming fast and furious. And it's like before you can think about one, there's something else that you have got to think about. And then when we think about how many companies have been really either terminating or reducing their ethical teams that are supposed to help them deploy something that is trustworthy, something that is responsible, something that is built with a particular kind of integrity and respect for community. So there's so many things, but the challenges present for me a great space, because what we're realizing is that many of these generative technologies are being deployed in us, and they're learning from us. They're definitely doing that. And I think what the organizations, the companies who are creating these things and deploying them are saying is that you can't test the risk in a lab. You've got to deploy it and test the risks in the real world. And that's what they're doing. They're testing those risks in the real world, because you really cannot sit in a lab with your designers, developers, and ethicists and say, we've got this correct. Only when millions of people start to use it, then you realize the scope of the kinds of challenges that you're going to see. So where there are those risks, and we've got to always pay attention to those risks, there are still these extraordinary rewards when you think of it as a companion for a student or someone who's working on a document, or someone who just needs to get those creative juices flowing, or someone who needs to just jump over that writer's block wall, or just, for people who just want to use this to inspire them to some, greater level of creativity. The other thing is that when we think about these tools, they are pre-trained. These models are pre-trained. So a lot of the information is more what I would consider rote type of learning, more a machine that's regurgitating things that we have thought about in the past. It's not abstract imagination. It's not abstract intelligence, so you are going to be repeating and sharing things that have already been thought about. But these are the things that we are dealing with now as a society. And that is why it is so critical, particularly when we think about disinformation and a tool like generative AI or the deep fakes or the ways in which you could manipulate media using a tool like this. Just a lot to think about. And I think for me, what gives me life is the fact that there is a robust community of AI ethicists and tech ethicists and data ethicists and persons committed to responsible AI who are looking at these challenges and looking at ways in which we can detect in real time and mitigate in real time. And as I said to you at the beginning, I am very passionate about augmented collective intelligence. And I have a background in psychology and a background in disability rights as well, and working in rehabilitation and just understanding what these tools can do for people with disabilities. But then the question becomes, how many individuals with disabilities are actually helping us build these tools? So they may look like companions, but once they're being used, we realize they're an extraordinary amount of risk. And that's something that I want to share with you. Recently, I was speaking at State of the Net in DC, a very, great conference. And one of the speakers spoke about the fact that he was using generative AI and he was doing some research on suicide. And when he got the information, what he got was a wrong number for suicide hotline. Now, think about if it was a teenager using that tool to get information, someone who is at, a most vulnerable place, and you get something for a suicide hotline that is an inaccurate number. Now you understand how critical those risks are. And if we don't deal with it, many of these tools can put us in really very troublesome and very painful situations.
Even though we have ChatGPT, and for those of you still new to the tech, to the technology, I love kind of describing it, right, and describing that acronym, because I think it's really important, right? Generative, pre-trained, transformer. Like, transformers changed my life, right? My first kind of foray into AI was being an early member of the Amazon Alexa team. And as part of that journey, it was hard. We were manually trying to figure out what were people going to say and then map it to the code that would run, that would answer their questions. And we were using algorithms to do this work, but a lot of it was kind of manual, like what do they want and how do we serve it? It didn't feel like AI at all, actually, when I was doing that work. And as we move forward, these are the things that I remember at Alexa in those early days being very similar to now. Like, people were very excited to have a thing they could talk to, very excited to have a bot with a button, but didn't realize that in that excitement, you really need to think about, is Alexa going to say the right thing to the right person at the right time? And many times in those early days, it did not, right?
And I think for me, pre-trained, that's the word for me always, pre-trained. Yes. And I think people have to think about trained by who, trained with, trained for how long, questions around the transparency of the training, the accountability of the training, the accuracy of the training. And it's pre-trained. So it's something that you're getting that is pre-packaged. The thoughts, the views, the concepts, the ideas. And that's what you've got to think about. That pre-trained, and understand pre-trained means it has limitations.
That's right. So that's why I get so worried when businesses are like, I want ChatGPT. I'm like, do you know what the G and the P and the T, like, do you know what they are? And so yes, 100%. The pre-trained part, I always tell people, it's trained on 499 million plus websites. And those websites, guess what? Were written by humans over decades. And those humans, they embellish, they lie, they have opinions. They actually tell their opinions as fact. And now we're seeing that same tendency show up. And that's not even including the systemic bias that gets amplified. This is just accuracy of the information that's trained on. So the good news is, as you mentioned, It's great, exciting, it does good things, but it has a very slippery slope into providing misinformation, into providing information as fact. On the happier side, I do want to mention what you had just briefly touched on, and I don't know if we want to go around again around the disability side, right? I have a son with Down syndrome, so I'm very interested and passionate about how do we create technology literally for everyone, right? Everyone has a different set of capabilities. We now have a tool that is generative, which means that, right, as part of the G in the GPT, it's generative, which means I, as an individual, don't need to know how to do it for everyone. So if we're not thinking about them, if we're not, and that's the good news, we have a tool now that can actually help us ideate on how we build more accessible solutions. But it comes down to the business. Is that something we're asking our developers to do? Are we even using this tool in that way? So if you have any other comments on that, I would love to hear kind of what you're thinking about the accessibility community.
That's a critical question. And, I'm very committed to neurodiversity, and I'm very committed to diverse intelligences. And I believe with technology, we get that opportunity to really augment that collective intelligence and those diverse intelligences that are so critical. The question is, again, because this is pre-trained, what is the data it has been trained on? And whether or not that data presents an equitable learning experience for persons with disabilities, or is it that it's really ableist technology and persons with disabilities have got to find their way in it? My thing is, how many individuals with disabilities are assisting in the development of these technologies? How inclusive is it? The fact that we've got to put those prompts in there, and then the prompts give us the answers that we want. So my thing is, yes, it is still to me a very traditional way of getting information, but yet it can provide an extraordinary amount of information. I was just thinking, saying to myself, if I was homeschooling my children, this would be an excellent tool for me to build, curriculum, to get information, a real great student companion. It's that. But then if you're thinking of other individuals who may have other types of neuro, diverse challenges, whether or not it really delivers. But I think it's a starting point. And I think what we're going to see would be this approach being used by other developers. And it's going to be morphed into more and more things, and that's the thing about technology. You can't hold it back, but it does present a platform on which we can develop and build. But it also presents a platform for us to really think about questions around equity. And we're talking about millions of people using this, right? But when we think about the digital divide, right here in the United States of America, this beautiful place, there are millions of people who don't have access to technology. So what does this do for the informed and the uninformed? How many people may not be able to pay for this technology as well when it comes to the information? Who's going to get the information and who's not going to get the information? Who has digital access and who is it going to create a wider divide when it comes to information, when it comes to that accessibility, when it comes to the ability to get the information that's required for you to make very solid decisions about your life. And that's the thing about algorithms, is that algorithms oftentimes make decisions about us without us even knowing. When we think about those challenges in loans and credit and just real estate and education and healthcare, So we've got to think about who's adopting these generative technologies, where they're going to be used, and whether or not the individuals who are going to be using these technologies really understand the ethical implications and the long-term impacts.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And before we go into the next question, Sorbel, is there anything you want to, because I wanted to just have a little bit of conversation around the disability space, because technically responsible AI is inclusive of that. But is there anything you'd call out in that you've learned or worked on in the past, or any experiences you want to share there?
Yeah, so I went to a book signing for Meredith Broussard's new book, More Than a Glitch. And it was really interesting and really enlightening for me. And one anecdote that she mentioned was that some company was trying to come up with a wheelchair that could go up the stairs. And that sounds like a really good thing, right? But when they asked people who were, who depended on wheelchairs, when they actually asked them, they said, no, that sounds painful. That sounds weird. I just want to have a ramp and I want to have an elevator. That's all I want. I'm comfortable in my wheelchair. And so that was really eye-opening for me, because it never occurred to anyone to ask people who actually will use these things, what do you think of this? Will this be useful? Will you be comfortable using something like this? So, I think responsible AI is inclusive AI. Actually include people. Don't just assume things.
Yes.
Include them in the conversation. Ask them. And get their perspective first before you build for them. And that's what inclusive product building is. Really get a representative sample and get representative data before you build anything, and then just put it out there in the market as if it will serve everyone equally.
And I think we need to take it a step further. We need to bring persons with disabilities to design the technology. And it's really a paternalistic kind of approach that we've always had to persons with disabilities, as though, the able-bodied always know what the disabled or the differently abled required. But it's so important to have persons with disabilities designing these technologies involved from the beginning. That is equity, that is empowerment, that is justice, and that's what we want to do.
Yes, and I agree that is justice. I've often looked at my career and how many people I've hired and who have been in, how many conversations I've been in over a 25-year period, and I've never seen more that I can count on my hands how many, on one hand, how many people with different abilities, specifically those confined to a wheelchair or those who have visible disabilities, ever become UX designers, ever become software engineers. Not that they can't. I know a lot of them, they've had to go and create their own innovation labs to be supported in this way. But there's a gap, like a systemic challenge here. It's not, because if you look across, they are an extreme. I think as a Hispanic Latina in executive leadership, that I'm a minority, but I look at people in wheelchairs, I look at people who have vision disabilities. Like, I don't see any building the software that is meant to serve everyone. And this is very concerning to me, and something that I think only businesses and leaders have an opportunity to impact. So Sorbel, I want to go back to you, because a lot of us are not CEOs. There's probably some in the audience, but most of us are kind of contributors, right? We're in these businesses, maybe starting our own business. We're building these solutions ourselves. As an individual, what advice maybe would you give to individuals that are on this journey? Especially, even maybe tell your story about like your journey in this space, but what would you tell someone who's like, hey, I'm passionate about this. What should I do with this passion? Or how do I fix something that I've seen that's not being built the right way? What advice would you give to someone in that place?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a great question. And it's something that, I ask myself every single day, because I was brought into a team that, wanted my perspective, that benefited from my perspective in terms of protecting our users, right? And not just the US perspective, but the global perspective that I had is something that they wanted from me. And so my recommendation would be to speak up. Don't be afraid to say, hey, this may not work for this group, or maybe we should do more research on that group, or this focus group, this team is not diverse enough to launch a product that will serve everyone. I think being brave, and I know it's easy for me to say, right? But just have courage to speak up, because they're bringing you in for exactly your diverse perspective and for your unique perspective. I know that sometimes, in any company, not just tech companies, but any company, things can get so, people don't want to speak up because they don't want to be seen as a disruptor or negative Nancy or whatever you want to call it. But I think it's very important to, if you really care about that community, for example, if I really care about the Hispanic community, I would speak up if AI was being used for things like, maybe immigration or employment, because we know that those models are trained to kind of exclude people with certain last names, with certain, even nationalities. So I think having the courage to speak up is key when you're in IC.
Yes, wonderful. I appreciate that so much. Renee, what about you?
Well, I think for me, if you're not involved in the world of tech, it's the thing that I tell everyone, invite yourself to the party, because that's exactly what I did as a criminologist and criminal psychologist, realizing that we needed to have a voice in AI, a voice in data science, because so many of the algorithmic decision-making tools were being deployed in the criminal justice system. The risk assessment tools that continue to create unique challenges. And we're seeing that in particularly in child welfare and child protection in Allegheny County, those algorithms are giving families, and particularly families with disabilities, an extraordinary amount of challenges. A most recent case with husband and wife, both of them having disabilities, and taking their daughter to the hospital who was dehydrated. And before she could leave the hospital, the child was taken away from them because their disability in the child welfare and child protection system and built into the algorithm, disability seems to be a data point for risk. So a parent with a disability, having a child with a disability or not, it presents a unique type of risk. So invite yourself to the party, get involved in the conversation. If you're working in technology at the moment, I say there is no wrong time to do right. So there's always an opportunity to do the right thing. And ethics. If you don't understand what's going on in the world of responsible AI, you don't understand how ethics and innovation can live in the same space, then just upskill yourself in real time. Think about questions around accountability, transparency, explainability, accuracy, auditability. How do we audit these generative AI tools? How do we audit AI tools? Think about those questions around whether or not these are technologies and how are they impacting communities. Think about that. Think about those data sets and think about whether or not we're using data in ways that are trauma-informed and justice-oriented. And just think about the world and think about the fact that we have an opportunity to use technology to just reimagine this world and create the kind of society and humanity and future that we can really be proud of. And ask yourself, am I doing the right thing in real time to build a future that I can be proud of? And to data scientists, I always say, you're not building tools, you're not building systems, you're not building solutions, you're building future societies. That's what it all comes together. And if you're doing that, you have a social responsibility, and you have a responsibility to yourself and to all of us to do the right thing in real time.
Yes, that is right. Wow. What an amazing time we've had here. I'd love for us to go just one more time around and tell the audience a little, maybe some final thoughts, maybe some resource we want to share with them, some way for them to get started. So maybe we'll start with you, Renee, and if you can provide some final thoughts, and then also let the audience know what best way they can get in touch with you.
Well, I think you can get in touch with me anywhere, on LinkedIn, on Instagram, just about any social media platform. But the best place to get in touch with me would be the University of Virginia School of Data Science, our website. My email and my contact information is right there. All I can say to people is that, we are living in the space and the age of AI. I think we need to upskill our literacy in real time. We need to understand that these technologies are not going anywhere. They're just going to be more and more and more technology for us to really have to interact with. I would say just bring an ethical approach and understand that when we talk about ethics, we're talking about each other. When we talk about ethics, we're talking about an ethics of care. We're talking about a due diligence. We're talking about due process. We're talking about fairness. And we're talking about just building futures where we all can feel included, represented, and appreciated, and of course, always respected.
Thank you so much, Sorabel. I would love for you to do the same. Just some final thoughts to close out this session and the best way for people to connect with you.
So the best way for people to connect with me would be LinkedIn. LinkedIn is amazing. I love the community. I love how involved and how active the responsible tech community is. Some final thoughts. Educate yourself. Don't fall for the hype. There's a lot of hype going on right now, especially on LinkedIn. We're a very narrow-minded group in terms of just talking about the same things, but we don't step back to educate others. Like people who are not on LinkedIn may not know what ChatGPT is or what machine learning is. So that's something that I'm actually trying to do because people don't want to ask questions. They think they should already know it. And so they feel a little embarrassed to ask, but I think you should ask questions. You should educate yourself. There's plenty of material out there where you can learn about what's going on in the world. Another thing I would say is once you educate yourself, make sure you are communicating with your representatives because I don't think our government is thinking ahead in terms of the consequences of AI, not just the ethics of it, but the automation part of it. A lot of jobs will be lost, will be automated. And that's going to have really, really positive, but also negative consequences on both our blue collar workforce and our white collar workforce. So I think we should be very mindful of that and also put pressure on our government to also be mindful of it.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. Of course, I'm Noelle Russell. It's been my pleasure to post both these amazing women and their unique experiences in responsible AI and accessibility, specifically in generative AI. You can always find me on LinkedIn. You can also find me at noellerussell.ai. We all are, just very passionate about building community. I think that's probably my biggest advice and maybe thing we'll leave you with is find a community. You are not alone in the things that you worry about and the things that you're thinking about. And there's a lot of comfort that comes from realizing that you're not alone in that. And so reach out to any of us, but there's also communities on LinkedIn. There's communities in real life meetups. A lot of us go to the same conferences and we become not just, colleagues in this work, but really friends in this work. And so I'm very grateful that my friends joined me for this session today. I'm very grateful for you spending time with us. And please don't hesitate to reach out. There's a couple of things I heard from both of you that I wanted to re-mention. One is AI. It's, responsible AI is inclusive AI. I absolutely love that. I might make a t-shirt out of it, Sorabel. So that was amazing. And then it's never too late to do the right thing. And which I learned from Renee, no matter where you are, what career you're in, what focus you are in, it's never too late to just turn your mind and care about this idea, care about responsible use of this technology and become an advocate for the cause. And I think all three of us believe in just telling those stories. Be willing to tell your story on a LinkedIn article, build a blog, it doesn't matter, but those stories are what changes our societies. So very, very honored to have had these women here. Thank you for having us. And we will see you around the responsible AI and ethical community. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.